colleagues who will be speaking at this seminar and the titles of their interventions, I do have three main notes. I consider myself one of the followers of the Iraqi scene, and throughout 20 years, 6 to 7 election cycles were done. Six, if we do not take into consideration the constitutional election in 2005. So the first elections to be held in Iraq. So throughout 20 years, 6 to 7 election cycles were conducted. I had some fleeting notes under the title Democracy the Iraqi Way. The first note is that it is not a condition for you to win the election to form a government. Anywhere in the world, the winning bloc or the winning party is the one that forms the government. In Iraq, this is not a prerequisite, and this happened in 2010 when the Iraqi list led by Iyad Allawi won, but the the law bloc formed the government, and this has happened again later on. The party that won most seats in the Council of Representatives did not form the government by the end. So it means that in Iraq, the loser of the election can form the government sometimes, not the majority of times, but sometimes. Winners governments fall quickly. Al-Maliki's government fell quickly after Mosul fell for ISIS, and the same happened in 2019. This is the first note, and the second note is that in Iraq we have militias that have parties and parties that have militias. So if you have a militia, it turns into a political bloc, and perhaps my colleagues will talk about this, especially with Qais al-Khazali and his party that defected from al-Mahdi army and now forms a political bloc in the parliament. So this guarantees them continuity in authority. And the third and final note is the Muqtada Sadr phenomenon in Iraq, and I call it a phenomenon because he is always capable of mobilization and wins the elections, but he has never been able to invest in this winning the election to play a main role in forming the government. Usually doesn't persist and prefers to withdraw. And 2020, all of his bloc resigned from the parliament, even though they were the winning bloc, and they refused to continue and persevere. They preferred to withdraw, and last time they boycotted the election entirely. So after the three notes that I gave about the Iraqi election throughout 20 years, allow me to move on to our colleagues who will be speaking about the parliamentary election during this seminar, the results and the future of the political system. Allow me to introduce them quickly. We have Dr. Harith Hassan, who is a research associate and academic director at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. He has a PhD in political sciences and communication. He was a non-resident researcher at Carnegie Middle East and a researcher at the Central Europe University. He has many research papers that were published in Arab and English academic journals. He focuses on the issues of the state and its relation to the community, identity, and development. We have also Dr. Haider Saeed, head of the Gulf and Arabian Peninsula Studies Unit at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies. He has a PhD in linguistics from Al-Mustansiriya University, Baghdad, 2001. He focuses in his research on Iraq and the communities that have division, and he has several books about identity, citizenship, the culture of the state in Iraq, social sciences in Iraqi universities. He wrote 3 chapters in a book published by the Center about ISIS, and he contributed to the authoring of the National Report on Human Development in Iraq 2009 and 2014. Last but not least, we have Dr. Sarhang Hamma Saeed, who is a researcher specialized in peace building and analyst in Middle East issues, who has 20 years experience in government and non-government institutions as well as media institutions. He used to be the director of the Middle East programs at the Peace Institute, U.S. Peace Institute. He has masters from Duke University in the U.S. He has many publications about fighting ISIS, repatriation of displaced people, as well as the effect of traumas and climate change. Welcome everyone to this seminar, and I would like to start with the first intervention presented by Dr. Harith Hassan, entitled the election of 2025 in Iraq and competitive authority. You have 20 minutes. Thank you very much, Dr. Marwan. Thank you to the distinguished attendees. Dr. Marwan, you made it easier for me with the notes that you have mentioned, because some of the points that you mentioned were actually things that I wanted to talk about, and you gave us a general idea about them. So I have 2 main pillars that I will be focusing on. First, in relation to the election and what it means for the nature and the future of a political system in Iraq. And second, the international regional conflict, specifically the American one in Iraq. The argumentation that I would like to present regarding the latest election is that it instilled the political system in Iraq as a module for what is called the competitive authoritarianism, which was a term coined by Stephen Levinsky, and it refers to a political system where there are competitive elections and some kind of or some quantity of political freedom. However, the general political framework is engineered in a way that doesn't allow usually the loss of the party dominating the authority. There is competitiveness, but the outcomes of these elections usually are in the favor of the dominant party. And in Iraq, the latest elections instilled or proved the situation of Iraq as a new module of authoritarianism. So the situation related to the main political parties, these elections were celebrated by them as they had large numbers of participation. The official announced percentage is 56% compared to the percentage in 2021, which was 41%. But even here, when we look at this, at the way this percentage was calculated, we will see that there is some kind of engineering, because usually the turnout in elections is calculated using the number of people who have participated in the elections versus the people eligible to participate. So this was a new way to calculate the voters, the number of voters compared to the number of those who went to registration centers and renewed their election cards. So those who renewed their cards are not considered a legitimate voter there, and they do not believe that going to these centers is a political stance by itself. So if we look at that as per the internationally approved criteria, in my opinion, or not in my opinion, I did the calculation actually, it's about 42% as per international standards. But more importantly, the idea that these elections are free and integrate, and this was propagated by the media and the representative for UN in Iraq in a speech that he delivered recently on the occasion of finalization of the work of the UN office in Iraq. So what do we mean by free election? This assumes that there is a possibility of reasonable equality and access to resources by the competitors, and neutral institutions managing this competition or competitiveness. But in Iraq, in the Iraqi elections, there are several elements clarifying that these elections lack the required criteria for equal opportunity to make the elections free and honest. For example, there are no rationalization or regulation for the general expenditure and for the financing of political parties, and so these elections were based on customers actually, meaning that political parties that accessed resources were more capable of attaining the outcomes that they desired. And the resources in Iraq, I classify them into two types. First, violence. Parties that have militias and armed groups and force on the ground are more capable compared to parties that do not have such kind of force or violent force. And the second resource is rentiering, so access to resources and the returns of the Iraqi oil, which usually happens when a political party assumes certain positions in the state and certain government contracts in the state, and so they access this rentiering. And the dominant parties in the political system in Iraq are capable of accessing these resources. And the evidence is that the Commission of Election this time have filtered the candidates to a large extent. So it's some people said there was a council for diagnosing the best interest in Iraq, and it deprived some candidates from participating due to simple reasons. For example, they don't have a university degree, or they committed violations in their election campaign. And there were complaints about political parties that have armed militias.
That there are some armed wings, this did not happen at the level of the federal court. So this leads me to something else, to what I called the mediating institutions that are supposed to be the main reference when it comes to organizing this kind of political competition. These institutions are increasingly under the control of the different institutions, including the communication and media agencies. So the political parties in Iraq, so I use political parties in Iraq. What we have practically in Iraq is a kind of a sponsor that is surrounded by a network of followers or those who are cronies to it. And this is a kind of a sponsor that preserves this network for him to be able to reach this rentier resources. So this is a kind of relationship that would enable them to reach these resources? So, do they have an armed militia? Do they have tools better than others in order to be able to reach these revenues or this rentier resource? So, they rely on these two kind of components. So that is why the elections in Iraq, these are not competitive elections between different ideologies or conceptualizations about the country, the organization of the economy, social programs, and foreign economy. So, practically speaking, these are elections within each and every demographic group. And this is considered a component, and within each sectarian group, there is this kind of transactional relationship. So the voters, when they go to vote, this is not based on a political or ideological trend that they would like to vote for. This is based on a kind of a partisanship that they would like to establish and they want to benefit from. Of course, there are some exceptions, and this is part of the three spaces that I talked about, the Kurdish, the Sunni, and the Shiite spaces or groups. Some of the leaders of a main Kurdish political party, he frankly said, even if we lose the elections, we have weapons, we have power on the ground, and this is a decisive component. And indeed, despite the crises and the challenges that we face, and despite the fact that they have seen many competitive political parties that have come up with a number of slogans that called for change, these political parties remained in control on the ground, and the other ones, they have just splintered with time. So that is why the question that I posed in one of my short articles, and I would like to pose the same question, why elections are happening in Iraq. In my viewpoint, elections happen because it still remains the most important source of legitimacy. The political regime is based on a number of competitive centers that have different conceptualizations and ideas when it comes to legitimacy on the ground. So they need, I think, elections because they need to have so the second thing is that these elections are very important indeed in order to manage this competitiveness between the different influential parties. So these elections are very difficult to create change. So the change that can happen is the balance between the different powers, relative powers. So when we have Nour al-Maliki with less seats in parliament and the other current with a higher number of seats in parliament. Here we're talking about two kind of clientelism or two kind of clientele networks. We're talking not about one intellectual and political system. And the situation is going to continue as such. We're going to have engineered elections, a high level of competitiveness based on the main powers on the ground until one of those centers succeeds in imposing its control on the political system, and consequently the elections would become only a formality, or the situation would change altogether. My own conviction, and this is not only my own view, many people who have studied political transfers and transformations, these elites do not change out of their own political will. They have to have some concerns and fears to change or to come up with some change. So they do not allow the expansion of the political system or the opportunities for the opposition just because they feel a level of altruism. No, they feel that the cost of keeping the status quo is much higher than the change that can happen. So the political powers, they were forced to come up with some changes because there were protests taking place in the Shiite community. They took to the street. and the Iraqi political system, and Haider is going to talk about this at great length. We have the Shiite groups that are prevailing, but at the end of the day, the authority, the decision-making processes, all of them are carried out by the Shiite group. So these forces in the face of these protests, they came up with a number of concessions. They changed the prime minister, and also they changed the electoral law that had led to the rise of some independent voices. And in light of those protests in the region, in other areas, so they have lost their impetus. They have faced a level of fatigue, and they were splintered into a number of local groups and had not led to one unified political group that can mobilize and negotiate with the different parties. The political regime was able to regain control. It was able to dismantle many protest groups through luring them into entering into the influencing groups or the influential groups. So the second argument that I would like to talk about here, so this power no longer fears what is happening inside or those inside, but the fear comes from the external transformations happening in the area, in the region. And consequently, Iraq, akin to other countries in the eastern part of the Arab world, is impacted by the geopolitical issues that are much larger than the issues that are happening internally. There's an increase in pressure by the United States of America on the Iraqi powers, particularly when it comes how they deal with the armed factions. There is a retreat when it comes to the Iranian hegemony. This is a relative retreat or regression, but at the end of the day, for Iran, Iran is the space of hegemony for them, the most important, not because of this geographical neighborhood and the long borders between the two countries, because the cost of hegemony in much less than other countries, because Iraq has great resources. Perhaps the problematic lies in the term heymana, hegemony. So it is less than the cost it would cost the Iranians when it comes to Lebanon, because the forces in Iraq can fund themselves by themselves. So in the current situation, we have seen the mobilization that is happening after the 7th of October, the Israeli war on Iran, and the coordination framework feels that there is some concern. And we do not allow the Israelis to target, this is what they say, to target the armed factions in Iraq, and we do not accept that they would once again target the American forces in Iraq. So there have been some arrangements as a result of an agreement that was concluded between the Iraqi government and the Americans, which is a kind of a gradual withdrawal. It is not a withdrawal, this is a redeployment from the center of Iraq to Erbil. And here we're talking about 2,000 soldiers. We're not talking about a large number of American soldiers. And as I said on previous occasions, and I say it, and I do apologize for those who heard me say that previously, I think that the main influence of the US in Iraq is not military, it is an economic influence. Iraq, as a rentier country that relies almost absolutely on its oil revenues, 90% of the budget relies on that. We're talking about a situation that is very difficult indeed. We have a fund which is the development fund, and the United States of America is the one that controls the flow of the hard currency, the dollar, and Iraq relies on such currency because it does not only rely on oil revenues, but also on imports. Iraq imports most of its goods, so they need these hard currencies in order to fund their imports. Any attempt to slow down or to limit the flow of the dollar into Iraq, or any action, there are threats by the Americans towards the Iraqi government. They say if a new government is formed which is loyal to Iran, we're going to use this weapon against you. And if the flow of the dollar stops or halts, because this is a cash-based economy when we talk about Iraq, so we can imagine in a few weeks this would lead to the collapse of the Iraqi economy. So the coordination framework. So these forces, and here I'm going to conclude my intervention, these forces, the coordination framework, on the one hand, they do not want the armed forces or factions to take them into adventures that would have great repercussions on the interests of these influential powers and would impact the political situation and the stability of Iraq. And the coordination framework looks at the popular mobilization as the defense power of the regime. Saddam Hussein had his they had their Republican Guard, but for the current political powers, they have the mobilization forces. So this would lead to losing the opportunities. That is why a very intricate balance should be stricken. This is what they try to do. And they started understanding the way Trump thinks, and they have started enabling a number of American oil companies. They grant them the conclusion of certain contracts. They had left left Iraq for quite some time, but now these contracts are concluded again. Now Iraq started signing these contracts with American companies without any competition, and in order to get a share of those profits, and this is going to impact even the other interests. So the elections happening in Iraq are happening for two main reasons. We have listened to the intervention by Dr. Harith, so to give a constitutional trait and also to try to gauge these relative weights of the different political parties within their own sectarian components. And I would like to move to the second intervention by Dr. Haider Saeed, who is going to talk about the elections in 2025 in Iraq and the civil forces and the future of the political regime. Dr. Haider, the floor is yours. May the peace and blessings of God, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank you, and I would like to thank Dr. Marwan for the presentation, and I would like to thank you. As Dr. Marwan had mentioned, my intervention is going to focus on the analysis of the position of the civil forces and their weights when it comes to the elections that are taking place. And my analysis, it is not going to be an analysis of a specific power. I think that understanding the outcome or the result of the civil forces, and I'm going to analyze what I mean by the civil forces in the elections, this is related to the nature of the political and electoral system in Iraq. But I would like to start with the question, this is a theoretical question in elections studies, and we have prepared we covered this particular perspective, and they have emanated the question from the following idea: why are these authoritarian regimes, between quotes, why are they keen to have elections? The regime of Hosni Mubarak and the regime in Iran, why are they keen to have elections in their own countries? Other than the legitimacy question that Dr. Harith talked about, and that elections would give legitimacy to the regime, during the Iraqi elections, and I have written that in one of my posts, this is an opportunity to expand on that idea. The main function of these elections. So perhaps legitimacy can be achieved by 10-15%. But what I would like to talk about, this keenness, the fact that these political powers are very keen, particularly the ruling Shiite forces. Why are they keen? Because these elections would put the delineation of the different rules that would be undertaken on the ground. I think this was the basis of the elections that took place in 2025. And after that, when it comes to the Shiite forces and the nature of the political regime and how we have reached this formulation, which is the new concept that has appeared. So the main component that I would like to focus on is to analyze the situation when it comes to civil forces. But first of all, what do we mean by these civil forces? 2 weeks ago in the Arab Center, we had a seminar about the concept of the civil state. And of course, civil forces, since this is a nascent or new term in political terminology and in political discourse, it does not have clear-cut parameters. There is some enigma when it comes to this particular concept, particularly when it comes to the Iraqi situation. When we talk about civil forces, this does not indicate the secular forces or secularism in particular and only, but it also means, and this is the most important component, and this is the other component when it comes to the definition of this civil forces or civil force. This is a kind of a trans-sectarian kind of power. It doesn't mean that it is sectarian. There are a number of sectarian groups that have entered into the Shiite group. So if we would like to talk about the coalition of building and development, there have been a number of secular groups and personalities. The Wifaq movement, led by Iyad Allawi, the former prime minister, is one of the secular personalities who have joined this movement through his daughter Sarah. And it seems that she was able to get a seat in parliament as a result of that. So it doesn't mean only the Sunni secular groups such as At-Taqaddum coalition that was led by the previous Speaker of Parliament, Muhammad al-Halbousi, is a secular personality as it is known to us. But we do not classify them as being part of the civil forces. So what I mean by the civil forces, these are the trans-sectarian forces. And even the different Islamic parties and the Shiite ruling group, particularly in 2014 and 2015, they have used the civilian or civil terms. So they wanted to include these two meanings. They said that we are not theocrats and that we are open to add members that are not necessarily Shiite. So consequently, so the definition of civil forces, these are trans-sectarian forces. So during the recent elections that took place in 2025, if we would like to exclude the secular groups that entered into this Shiite framework or Sunni framework, there is a main alliance of the civil forces, which is the alternative alliance, Tahaluf al-Badil. So we had the left groups or forces, Tashreen forces, and so on. And practically speaking, this was the most important alliance that was concluded in this framework and that emanated its work from the national framework and not a particular sectarian framework. This alternative coalition or alliance was not able to get any points, and this was very, very surprising indeed. Personally speaking, and I'm going to talk about my two hats as an analyst and as a person who is embroiled in discussions between the different civil groups in Iraq. This result was surprising. I was expecting that they're going to get at least 7 points. And through very simple calculations to say that this candidate is going to win in Nasiriyah and X and Y are going to get 2 seats and Y is going to get 1 seat in Baghdad and Z is going to get this seat in Najaf, but the outcome was 0. And after that, there have been discussions, and here I would like to tell you the story that maybe it's the main thing that I would like to underline and add to it what Dr. Harith had said. And here I lean on a number of writings that were made within the civil groups. The civil group or force was not able to understand the social transformations that were happening in Iraq, and they were not able to reflect the aspirations of the rising forces in Iraq. And this was the argument that was used, and it came from two main sources. One source from inside the civil forces. They said that the civilian jargon or rhetoric remained not from the base or grassroots, because these parties, they do not reflect the reality on the ground. And I do refuse this justification. And I think, and here I'm going to resort to analysis, I think that what happened is due to the nature of the electoral system in Iraq. As the elections experts say, and this is something that is written for those who would like to know about these electoral system. So those experts, they say that the election systems or electoral systems reflects what those who designed the system want. So if I would like to say that this leads to a political representation, it should reflect the nature of the community. So this electoral system would reflect in a transparent way the nature of the community. And this is not true. And I'm going to analyze this. And this is my main objective of the intervention before I move to the other points. I'm going to analyze the nature of what the civilians were able to get in the elections in 2025 in order to understand the difference. And why is this happening? In the 2021 elections that were early elections that were held in October 2021 after the protest that took place in October and after the resignation of Abdel Mahdi's government, after the massacre that took place in the bridge of Zaytun at the end of November 2021, and that had led to the death of in excess of 70 protesters from the youth of Iraq, and the government resigned as a result of this pressure, and a new government was formed, and for the first time a new government was formed by Mustafa al-Kadhim after the resignation of the government of Adil, and this had led to early elections in 2021. In the elections that were held in 2021, and because the regime wanted that, and this would lead me to an article that I wrote talking about the October Revolution, and I said that this does not target or did not target the toppling of the whole regime, but what it wanted to achieve is to come up with radical changes within that government. I think that the tremor that the regime was subjected to or faced in 2019 and the protests that happened due to the nature of repression that people were subjected to, The regime also tried to follow two pathways in confrontation of the October protests. And I'm going to refer also to another paper that I presented in a conference with Dr. Barwan. So this was the main trigger of the many cases when it comes to repression that happens since 2020 and 23. And this has led to a number of procedures that it seems respond to the demands of the protesters, including amendments to the electoral system. And here I would like to talk about the elections and based on what system. Was it in keeping with what those who designed the system wanted it to be? So the first thing that we need to do from a relatively representative system that was used since 2003, because Iraq is looked at as a community that has multiple identities. And in political systems that have such kinds of communities, they talk about the following. They say it is not just for one person to get the votes of all people and to get the SNTV. That means I'm going to be getting all the votes, and this is going to be at the expense of 49% of the people who did not vote for me if I got 51%. When we have a community with multiple identities, I think relative representation would be the best system. So how does a relative representation system work in Najaf, for instance, or a Nasiriya or a Sulaymaniya that is mostly Kurdish, or an Anbar that is mostly Sunni? So in 2021, we moved from this particular system into another system. So we put an end to the relative representation system, and that was the pivotal component of this change. In a system such as this one, we had approximately 40 MPs who represent the protest groups and the civil forces. So what happened? And here I would like to talk about the following. I think there is some level of dynamism within the regime in order to close the public sphere more and more. I was in Paris and I presented the paper and I talked about Iraq after the flood, or Gaza or flood, and I talked about this dynamism that was followed after October 2023, but this mobilization that happened after the war on Gaza. And talking about these values, liberal values, as being a mirage, and we know these values, and when it comes to our relationship with Iran, in 2023, the electoral system was changed. So we had 40 MPs as a result of that. And it was not a good experience for members of October, because there have been a number of alliances coming from outside this group. We had Ala Rikabi, and there was only one MP who stayed with his great presence, and now the situation is different. So we're talking about a threshold of 1.7. This is the St. Lego system, 1.7 threshold. I cannot explain it to you very simply because we need a complete lesson to try to explain to you what we mean by this Saint-Ligo system. It is a way to distribute votes based on the number of seats available in the relative representation system. If you have 160,000 and another number of people, how can we distribute them if we have only 10 seats in one state? Saint-Ligo is a methodology whereby we would be able to distribute the votes based on the seats available. This is a methodology that dates back to 100 years ago. So this methodology was developed by increasing the threshold whereby the decision starts. So the traditional Saint-Ligo system starts with 1, 3, 5, and so on and so forth. In Iraq, we increase the threshold because I want you to understand me. It is close to the electoral threshold. So we raised it from 1.4 to 1.7 in these elections. What does it mean? It means the small political parties would not be able to reach the requirements of the threshold and they would not be included in the elections. So if the same MP, Sajjad Salim, for instance, who is against the militias, weapons, and so on, so the same votes that led to his victory in 2021 would not enable him to win the 2025 elections because we have the relative representation system or proportional representation system. So the votes that he was able to get in 2021 would not enable him to get that in 2025 because he represents a small force. I hope I was able to clarify what happened to these civil forces. As I mentioned, in my view, how can we explain transformations happening within the community if we suppose that these are social transformations? So that is why I do not think that this is a reflection of a social transformation. The point that was explained by Dr. Harith he talked about the circumvention that was used in accounting for the percentage of participation. We're not talking about the voters from the electorals or those who have the right to take part in the elections and vote, but we're talking about those who re-registered. And I wrote an article that is published on Al Arabi website. So the turnout would decrease in the local councils. These are the elections that took place months ago. So this is the first time that we see an increase in the number of turnout or participation. I wrote a post and I said this can be an indication that this is the new generation that is taking part in those elections and want to participate politically. But this still remains very strange in light of the absence of the Sadr group who are boycotting the elections. So the question, how have we seen an increased turnout within the Shiite group, taking into account the absence of the Sadri group? 2 minutes. I have two main ideas that I would like to reflect here. The first idea, what does this mean? I would like to move to the discussions that are happening within the civil groups after these elections. So they feel that this is a kind of a civil nakba or setback. Throughout the previous years, I feel that we have to seriously tackle this matter. Who said that politics should go through the legislative institutions? Who said that principles that the civilians defend national identity and rights should be part of this kind of mechanism? Who said that politics means working outside the institutions, political official institutions? In my view, this should be discussed in Iraq and outside Iraq, within the civil groups, CSOs, because I know and very closely the nature of dynamism that the youth of Iraq go through. For the first time, I feel that there is a new generation after 23. Perhaps we have some youth, new students, so they have not gone through the concept of the states as we did. This is a generation that lived within divisions. The second observation that I would like to conclude with is about the nature of the political system. Where is it after the elections? It seems that there is a coordination framework. So we are talking about specific weights. These are the main objectives. So they want to be specific about their political weights. In my view, no doubt, in Iraq, there have been attempts to build a consensual kind of system. And there are so many global and international examples. And I wrote a book, Reviews in the Iraqi Constitutions, in a chapter that talks about pluralism. So this consensual idea was proposed by the Americans. It was not an Iraqi thought. It was not a thought that was coined by the Iraqi political elite. So in the 90s, they thought about the nation state where we have a kind of power centers. So the idea lies in these consensual mechanisms when it comes to proportional representation, federalism. These are ideas that were brought by the Americans, and it was reflected in the transitional constitution. And the political elite was very much surprised. They said, why can 3 governors out of 18, if they refuse the draft constitution with an absolute majority, they would not go ahead with the constitution? Who gives them such a right? The political system should not rely or lean on the dictatorship of the majority. So what about the ethnic minorities in this consensual system? Where is their role when it comes to rejecting this draft constitution? That is why in the 2005 constitution, they tried to circumvent the nature of this system. And I said that the 2005 constitution, I have 1 minute, the 2005 constitution reflects this clash between these two viewpoints, between these two parties. That is why many components have been cancelled in this system, including the mutual veto between the two parties. So we moved into the smaller and during this period, and I do not so what has this led to? It led to an end of this consensual and proportional representation. I think that the system is the rule of the ethnic Shiite group. There is no power sharing. We do not have any consensual methodology. There is no partner from any component of the community, neither Christian nor Kurdi or Sunni. None of them participate in these very decisive topics and themes when it comes to the war on Gaza, what is happening in Iran, and the nature of relationship with the other Arab countries. These are only discussed within the ruling Shiite elite. And these disputes are happening within this particular elite, and these are the ones that delineate the narrative of the state based on this ethnic ruling group that deals with the other groups on the basis of the rights of the minority. I think this is the meticulous description of the current political regime. It is not a consensual system. It is a regime ruled by an ethnic Shiite group. So when it comes to Iraq, it is up to them to decide. One last point. So when we talk about Shiism or turning into Shiite, we're not talking only about the rulers. These are not the only components that form the elections. So why Iyad Alawi is dealt with as a Shiite? Why Muqtada al-Sadr? They dealt with him as a Shiite. We're not talking about only a ruling Shiite group. We're talking about a specific ideological definition when it comes to the Shiite identity. Those who are within the parameters of this group and those who are outside these parameters. Those who adopt and believe in the ideology are within that group. And here I'm going to conclude my intervention. Thank you very much, and I do apologize for having taken too long.
Thank you for your attempt to interpret the results of the latest Iraqi parliamentary election and the voting system that is followed. And now I move on to Dr. Sarhand, who will be presenting his intervention on whether the 2025 election results will reinstill stability in Iraq. Please go ahead, the floor is yours. Good afternoon. It is my honor to be here at the Arab Center and be with an elite of researchers that I respect, Dr. Harith, Dr. Haider, and Dr. Marwan as well. So my background is in peace building, and based on that, I perceive political systems and elections as so. So allow me to make some notes and then talk about the regional aspect and the U.S. Point of view of these elections, the practical results of these elections. Let's ask ourselves, was it a step to consolidate stability or instability in Iraq, or just maintain the status quo? All the details mentioned by my colleagues were things that I agree with in terms of their analysis. So in the elections, there were some amendments, some balances within the forces, and not a major kind of change. So the performance of the government to the citizens generally in the country, they are not satisfied with the performance of the government and the parties and the political parties. So the elections did not change anything in that regard, be it the Tishreen movement or the October movement. And if we look at the past decade, three major events took place in Iraq. First, ISIS dominated 1/3 of Iraq, and it was within Sunni objection to what was happening in Iraq. And then the Kurdistan region conducted a referendum on their autonomy, and also that was based on their objection to what was happening in Iraq. And third was the October Intifada or revolt, where Shiite youth were unsatisfied with the performance of the regime. So the main components, three components that we have, are unsatisfied with the performance of the government, and the other components such as the IZDs, Christians, and other groups are also dissatisfied, and perhaps they are in worse situation with being in Iraq. They are threatened. So everyone is dissatisfied with this performance, and the current election did not come up with a result that says to any of these components that the performance of the government will be better compared to the previous one. But this it's not a prophecy that the performance cannot be better, because I am only saying that this is the view of people. I'm dealing with them every day in my work, and I say that they didn't feel any change. And so in the political process, the history of political process, we can see that elections do not make change. Political decisions that make changes outside the parliament or outside the parliament. The parliamentarians or MPs only implement decisions that are being made outside their mandate. So these elections did not emerge with anything that would tell us that any change would take place in Kurdish spheres, Arab spheres in Iraq. It was said that these elections are important to implement the constitution. It's been 20 years this October. It's been 20 years since the Iraqi constitution has been approved. It wasn't enforced. There were bottlenecks and so on and so forth. And so now we're talking about its implementation, its enforcement. And now the elections have been finalized for 1 month, and the political elites in Iraq are not discussing how to avoid what was happening in the past 10 to 15 years, the dissatisfaction of the citizens. How do we achieve their satisfaction? How do we prevent terrorism from taking place again? How do we prevent polarization? How to enforce the constitution to reinforce the stability of the country rather than competitiveness to dominate military powers and economic powers. These elections and the results still do not tell us anything about that, and this is based on me following the political spheres and the everyday citizens. But it's not too late yet. I believe that we can deal with this situation still. So internally, domestically, the gap between the citizen, the people, and the state, on the other hand, is huge. And to me, it is the largest strategic challenge domestically, internally for Iraq. If we do not deal with this gap, then this upcoming generation of young people will not accept this kind of life. And so this could be a source for destabilizing the state, or a renewing human energy that would that if we invest in would contribute to the growth of the country. So let's talk about externally, the external aspect of things. The election has reinforced the Irani influence in Iraq. In terms of the numbers, the balance of power did not change. Their legitimacy increased compared to 2021 elections, where the Sadrist current withdrew, and other currents and factions formed the government. And now the government would say that they have more legitimacy than the former government because they have more participation and more larger number of seats. So they will talk about their legitimacy. But the Irani influence and impact in Iraq, it was not impacted in any way, even after the Gaza events. And when you talk to people in Iraq, they say perhaps it has become more obscure. The influence of Iran has become more obscure, but their resources, the resources that they access, did not change, but they use them more implicitly rather than explicitly. So the interests of Iran are still there. There are common borders. There is strategic depth to their influence, economic vision that they have to circumvent the US sanctions imposed against them. So Iran was not affected by these elections. Iraq, with all its factions, does not want to antagonize Iran, but they do want to reduce their influence so that they would have their independence with their decisions. And this is the main requirement and ambition of all sects and groups in Iraq. So after this regression of the Irani influence in the region, could this bring about a new approach where we can institutionally deal with this? Al-Kadhimi, Al-Sudani, and the current prime minister, they all try to establish a relation with Iran where it's institutionalized, a relation between two countries based on common interests. So the question right now revolves around an opportunity for regional change to go in that direction. Turkey, the relations and the balance of powers with Turkey did not change in Iraq, and the portfolios that they are interested in, such as security, water, economics, and the mainly economics and security. I believe that the Iraqis will continue, regardless of the nature of the upcoming government, to continue with Turkey because they want to continue with the development and they are incentivized to do that. And so there are more pathways for cooperation, and the dialogue between the Kurdistani Labour Party and the government, if successful, can bring about good things for Iraq. As for Syria, the cooperation now, the Iraqi fear from what is happening in Syria right now is great, and the elections have yet to make any changes, and there is caution about what's happening in Syria in terms of the ruling class, the pathway or the route that is of things taking place. The elections did not bring about anything new in terms of what is happening in Syria, be it on the Syrian side or in the Iraqi side. And the Gulf states also have their relations, friendships, and interests in Iraq. The elections did not bring about any difference as well in these relations. Iraq, in its attempt to have relations with the surrounding and have merger with the surrounding countries is based on the interests, and the interests of the Gulf states is for Iraq to remain outside or away from the Irani influence, and that it merges in its regional neighborhood. And this the results of these elections, the opportunity for that is still there, and perhaps now the Gulf countries can help Iraq more than ever because there is momentum in Iraq going towards investments and economics. This can bring about job opportunities and positively influence the young generation if these projects were able to break the barrier of corruption, which is taking all the projects in favor of the political parties in Iraq. And so this is an important point. Iraq and the Gulf countries can help Iraq with their relations with Turkey and with the USA, perhaps more so with their relations with the USA. The USA right now, their policy in the region is influenced more than anything or compared to any other administration with the decisions and the thinking of President Trump. So with other administrations, policy making was based on think tanks, intellectual centers, and powerhouses in the US, the Congress, and the policy is formed, and by the end, the president decides the way things are going. But now it's not an institutional decision. It is only on the level, personal level of the president of the USA. In this space right now, its existence in the memory of the US president is positive. Iraqis voted for him in Michigan, and he won Michigan in the election. And so this is a good association with the Iraqis in his memory. And Iraq supported Trump's as a candidate for the Nobel Prize, and Iraq talks in the language of power, economics, and this is something that interests President Trump. And perhaps you heard in the past few days that his mindset has been different, and he indicated the messages from government and faction spheres in Iraq as rumored. They would like to have a non-confrontational relationship with the USA, but this topic, this topic remains the main challenge, because there is a special envoy that was assigned to Iraq, and there are more questions than answers about the meaning of a special envoy. There is concern. Does this mean that this is comparable to other places? A special envoy to a country means they have hot files or fierce issues, or does it mean that they are open to business and projects? The future will clarify all of that, but Mark Savaya, in his statements, is encouraging Iraq and its stability and has close relations with some political spheres in the country. And his main focus was on the armed factions and the issue of armament. This is a complicated point in this relationship, and at some point, Iraq and the USA need to deal with this issue. Iraq can be an opportunity for the USA. Iraq cannot compete with its resources with Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and UAE, because their economic investment-based relationship with the USA is different. They talk about hundreds of billions or trillions of US dollars, but the economic situation of Iraq does not allow talking about such numbers. So they need more work to build an economic relationship and to form a notable numbers or represent a notable numbers in political spheres or economic spheres. So there is an opportunity there. I conclude with this point about the strategy of national security that was talked about days ago, which indicates that the USA is taking a step back in some issues in the Middle East. There will be investment-based relations, but they do not want to be a dominant force. They don't want another dominant force in the region. They don't want to be involved in democracy and political issues such as the past or at odds with the past. So with this weakening momentum of the USA as seen of the people in the MENA region. It started in the administration of Obama, and then Trump in his first administration, and then Biden. So this strategy of national security reinforces this role, and other presidents have attempted to leave the Middle East and reduce the American influence. But you could leave the Middle East, but the Middle East will not leave you, be it the Arab Spring, ISIS, political events. It will be there will always be events there in Iraq. There are 4 spaces of interest to the USA generally, and Iraq could be an arena for that. First, China. China is the main competitor for the USA, which is quite strong economically in Iraq from the production and the purchasing of oil and the relations of turning these oil products into projects in Iraq, and also Chinese products, which are quite ubiquitous in Iraq, everywhere. In Iraq nowadays, you find people who used to have Japanese or American cars who now own Chinese cars, actually, solar panel powered cars, solar panels in every house as well. So the economic roots of China are quite strong in Iraq, and this will be apparent and will be highlighted in the upcoming days. Now, the American companies working in energy is an attempt from Iraq to give the Europeans and the Americans a space for common interests, so that so you do not focus on competitiveness with China. Also, the USA is interested in the Middle East when it comes to the Irani influence, and Iraq is a huge arena for the Irani influence, and this is a point of interest. USA is interested in the Middle East, and for it not to have any terrorism strongholds for ISIS and so on and so forth. And so the relation right now is positive, will remain positive, since ISIS was defeated and the liberated regions are stable for now, and there is a military based cooperation that is positive and does not represent a challenge. Also, economics, the Iraq is the fifth when it comes to gas and oil reserves, and the relations could be positive and could achieve stability if it's possible to go beyond the issue of factions and armed factions. And this is where I'll stop. Thank you very much, Dr. Sarahmand, for this intervention that focused on the influence of Iraqi parliamentary elections on the foreign relations of Iraq, and regionally and internationally. I will now give the opportunity to the attendees to ask questions or perhaps some concise remarks. I'll start with Dr. Muhannad. Please go ahead. Do we have a microphone? Thank you very much. The interventions were all amazing, and I follow the Iraqi developments as well. A question for all the panel members. Yes, I am Iraqi, and I follow the regional developments. So, since Iraq has nominated Trump for the Nobel Prize of Peace, which is a huge risk since he assassinated Soleimani Abu Mahdi al-Muhandas in the Baghdad airport, this is a risk for the Shiite ruling elite described by Dr. Haider as a risk, but they understand the equations of power here. And it seems to me, this is my own analysis, that the political powers in general in Baghdad are tending to form a government that is out of the Irani influence, but the greatest influence of Iran would be in the parliament. So, would it be possible for President Trump to understand the Iraqi situation and go back to his previous policy after 2021? He used to give licenses to deal with Iran to import electricity, so some kind of acceptance, preconditional acceptance with the relations to Iran. Or is there a new policy, and Trump will implement or go on with his threats to Iraq regarding the influence of Iran? So my question is directed to all speakers. Thank you, Dr. Marwan. I believe speakers could require hours to present their research papers. This is quite interesting. Dr. Harith, you talked about the U.S.-Irani conflict in Iraq, and you said that the U.S. influence is economic vis-a-vis military political influence on the side of Iran. Can we see that in the coordination framework? And Dr. Haider, Dr. Khalbousi, and with in Iraq, can you give us some indications of this meeting with the Amir and the Prime Minister, and would it affect the future of Iraq? Can their visit mean that there is Arab support for the Sunni existence or Sunni alliances from your point of view? Thank you very much. Dr. Elias, the floor is yours. Thank you for your interventions, and as someone who doesn't follow everything that is happening in Iraq, so accordingly, my question to Dr. Haider, uh, you from your analysis, you described the ruling elite as Shiite nationalists. So how do you compare that to the pre-2003, pre-US invasion? Was it a Sunni force by the same standards of analysis, or was it different? And how is it different? As I just want to know, as a politician or someone specialized in politics, I want to understand your analysis of that. And Dr. Harith, can you elaborate on the information of how the US influence is more economic than political? You alluded to the fact that Iraq's revenue of USD is in the Federal Reserve Bank. There is a office that decides on that. What mechanism is used? I'm sure it's a complicated mechanism, but if you could elaborate on the mechanism of USD revenue in Iraq. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Elias. Go ahead. The gentleman in the back, please introduce yourself. Good afternoon, Abdullah Ta'i. Thank you very much, Dr. Marwan, and thank you to the other speakers. There are many questions on my mind, but I will try to be concise here. Dr. Haider, you talked about consocialism in Iraq, which is something important currently and in the upcoming days. It is an everlasting question. Did Iraq not achieve consocialism? And does this was mentioned by Dr. Azmi about Lebanon, and when it comes to voters, they will carve or make the political system as they want. And I believe there is still a missing link in understanding what happened after Sajjad in 2021, who got 10,000 votes in these elections. He got 4,000 votes only, around 4,000. So this is not attributed to the San Diego system only, and this coincides with what was happening in Kurdistan region, where the new generation Al-Jil Al-Jadid movement won 3 seats compared to 9 in the last electoral cycle. And we cannot forget that there are factors related to the civilian forces dealing with the political regime and the popular popular basis and the political process. Some had reservations on the nomination of Adnan al-Zurfi as head of the electoral list. Perhaps he represents pragmatism from the civilian forces, since al-Zurfi is part of the political party. But how was that perceived by the popular basis at the end of the day? And Dr. Harith, you focused on the clientelism in the electoral process. How do we interpret the return of sectarian slogans in the past elections to a great extent? And these slogans were not issued by the usual suspects. No, they were issued by forces or parties that are closer to moderation, that are usually moderate, and the national forces list, for example, Halbusi, who had adopted the reconstruction and development narrative. Now he classifies himself as a secularist and a liberalist, and he talked about these slogans as well. And last but not least, in relation to the regional relations, I believe that with Iraq and Syria, there is a closure for this portfolio for Iraq, and it's been clear that this was given to the head of Iraqi intelligence exclusively to deal with this issue in its security boundaries and not move on to the political domain of things, at least until the elections are finalized, due to the polarization taking place in Iraq also. Since Dr. Sarhan talked about energy, oil, and the relationship with the USA, at the same time, you talked about the fear of the outside world. To what extent can these forces or powers exercise pragmatism to protect them from any repercussions coming from abroad? And we've seen that some forces that bombed the US embassy in Baghdad did not move in any way after the Gaza war, because they were part of the ruling. So what does it mean to practice more pragmatism? And I don't believe that Iranians have any problem with that. Thank you for your comments. I'll give the chance to the panelists to answer the questions. Let me start with you, if you would like to answer any question that has drawn your attention. So, what will the USA accept in terms of this government? This is the public stance of the USA, the fact that they do not want to interfere in the formation of the government and deal with the product of the electoral process, political process. And this is the issue unless Trump intervenes directly in the foreign policy. Foreign. This has been the U.S. foreign policy since 2018. In 2018, they wanted and they pushed to have a second cycle for elections, and they were not successful. And at the time in the USA, there were people who were critical of the USA and Mr. Brittman Gregg trying to intervene to this extent, and the political process would produce a government, a prime minister, and if there is space for common work, shared work, if they would deal with that, and if there's no space, they would deal with that with other tools. As Dr. Harith mentioned, the strongest tool for the USA is the economic tool, the economic instrument. And in his first administration, Trump talked about the nuclear option, as if that's the strongest instrument to change relations with other countries. And so the economic sanctions to be imposed on Iraq would be more destructive compared to Iran. Iran has the ability to recover and from these sanctions, but Iraq is not in comparison. Now it is rumored that the USA sent messages to stakeholders in Iraq, saying that they do not want people who represent armed factions in the government. Iraq is trying to interpret that perhaps not a minister, we could make him a general director, undersecretary, factions, perhaps not in the mobilization forces or other factions, but I believe that the USA is more decisive now, and people make the mistake in dealing with the administration of Trump, thinking that he is the same as in his first administration, but I believe that he is more decisive in these files right now. So I do not know if these rumors are correct at the or they discussed such level of detail, but I believe that they are serious and they know that they have leverage, more influence compared to the past, and they will use that, and they have been using that actually. So the forces pressured by the USA, when will they say enough? We will not go any further. This could be a source of tension, but for now, Iraq has still not indicated what government they will be producing. I believe it's still open for interpretation and wiggle room for that. So Iraq has given a scheme or a plan that there would be this arrangement to deal with this and that, and the USA was, if the USA is convinced, then it could give some wiggle room to Iraq, and the current administration is more flexible with Iraq compared to the first administration, but they are decisive with what they say, but they are more flexible with their tools. So I believe there is good communication. And just quickly to comment on the issue of social consensualism. Regarding what is happening in Syria, there are challenges related to the U.S. momentum, the political regime. These are concerning for the civilian forces, civil society organizations, because there would be more regression for the civilian spaces, and so this could be one of the points where this issue would be receding or regressing. So I believe one of the things that Gulf countries could pay attention to, any lack of financing by US or civil society organizations in the region. I propose to the Gulf countries to perceive it as a smart investment in these organizations. There are spaces related to democracy and ruling. Perhaps there are disagreements in that, but there are things that we agree on, like the ISIS not coming back and extremist groups not coming back, and so it's in the best interests of these states to support civil society organizations, so that they would serve that goal. I have other observations, but since we don't have time, we will move on to Dr. Haider and then Dr. Harith. You have 3 minutes, please. Thank you, Dr. Marwan. Perhaps there are two main points. First, the civil powers, sectarianism, and the current ruling system or regime. For the civilian or civil forces, as was mentioned by Abdullah, and I got a WhatsApp message from Kamal Al Khouri regarding this issue. Sajad got 8,000 votes in these elections, and let me say one thing. I don't know if there is room to talk about the context of sectarianism during the past few years, talking in the language of components or sects or groups, and the adverse impact of the Gaza war on these components. And perhaps that was one of the factors that drove civil powers to pay a hefty price. So Mr. Kamal asked me about the civil powers, and I believe that they did not interpret issues seriously. there's something that we haven't mentioned in this session. For example, clientelism. In these elections, there was a huge deal of both votes or buying votes. This is not something that was passing in the 2025 elections. It was the main thing. And all powers had pillars that are sub-organizations within their factions to organize the buying of votes. A friend of mine wrote to me once, and or forget about my friend. Let's talk about Al-Abadi, the former prime minister, who talked about this in a public conference. So we didn't even talk about that, how elections have become a trade or an industry for buying votes. This is something I didn't get the chance to talk about in my intervention. Elections is something that is ruled by laws. Those who vote for El Maliki or Sudani are not necessarily have the same behavior outside this political sphere. They are subject to the conditions imposed by others around them as well. So, for Al Badil Alliance that I talked about, and I supported them quite publicly, and I had dialogues with all their leaders, and they did not discuss this issue seriously, the issue of distributing people and thinking that we will have the proportional representation system, and the numbers and strengths of our blocks in Baghdad and Najaf and other governorates. This was not taken into consideration, and perhaps there were discussions among civil forces or powers about that after the elections. But I believe we need to learn many lessons from these elections. And as you said, what are politics? Why do we think that our these elections should create this change. For example, the October movement came from outside this political institution rather from inside. So this is the first point. The second point regarding the regime and where are we in comparison to other situations. This is quite complex, and you'll have to conduct some sort of comparative analysis. The regime that has been established since 2020. It is a nation state regime. And the main identity was Arab and not the Sunni identity. So all the elites introduced themselves as nationalist Arab groups, including the Shiites that were involved in the regime, or the intellects who had a main role in building the pan-Arab identity of Iraq since 20, or including Muhammad Bahdi al-Basir, Fadl Jamali. So there were transformations. We're talking about 80 years now. There were transformations, and what I'm saying here is that we need to ask the question, and the question is not whether the regime was Sunni or not. We need to ask why the Sunnis were prevalent in that regime. There are two factors that we need to understand. First, the traditions established by the Ottoman Empire, which was sectarian by nature, and which embraced the Shiites, and so those who were educators were Sunnis, and so in a state you find the bureaucratic levels and the educational levels are prevalent among Sunnis rather than Shiites. And the other factor is converting into Sunnism, which was not perceived as the Sunni identity was not perceived as a sect. It was an expression of religion and the general religion. It was taken for granted or as the main thing. For example, the Shiites and the Sunnis disagreed on the birth, the year of the Prophet Muhammad, and this was not sectarian. It was a pure religious difference, and this created a way of dealing with Shiites as a minority, and they protected them. And so the Shiite religious system was being sponsored by that what we can call per se the Sunni regime. So we have left a pan-Arab system that is based on the Iraqi identity, and that includes the Kurds as well, two identities that includes the Shiites as well. And so in 2003 we transitioned from a nation state into a country that identifies itself using various sub-identities, sub-nationalities. And so a system of components. And what I didn't get a chance to say is how we moved on from the Shiite coordination framework and the Sunni council. And so it does look like the system that is taking place in Lebanon on one hand, but on another hand, they say I'm the main ruler, and they identify huge or they define huge components like the Kurds as minorities. So based on the 1929 regime and the 2003 regime are quite different. And this, of course, is quite complex and was overly simplified, wasn't not discussed as was needed. And regarding the meeting of Al-Harbusi and Al-Khanjar meeting, Sheikh Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani, the Emir of the State of Qatar, just to comment on that, this meeting might mean that there could be support for Sunni components. There used to be a club, Nadi, that supported Sunnis in Iraq, including UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Jordan, Egypt, and the Syria of Al-Assad. We shouldn't forget that. I know that Al-Assad gave them directions on keeping some people and getting rid of some people in Iraq. So I believe that the Arab politics changed since 2014 with the appearance of ISIS Arabs, specifically Saudi Arabia, so that the failing state of Iraq is a continuous threat to them. So we moved on from dealing with the Iraq as a state to dealing with the Shiites, Shiite leaders. And if you see the policies of UAE and other countries, they go back to before 2010. And to be quite honest, I cannot give you a straight answer on that. But it is as per the requests of the US, Trump and the US, because Iraq is not a priority for them. The priority for them is Iran, to target Iran and not to target Iraq. To answer Mr. Abdullah and consensualism, as I said, it was a vision and the first document for the management of the state, and the ruling Shiite elite tried to circumvent this issue, and I don't believe that it was implemented. It was implemented partially, and it was reduced. And there are successful models of that. For example, in Malaysia, since their independence in 1957, they've had the Grand Coalition. In Iraq, that wasn't achieved. So there are elements that were not achieved. I believe that there was a project to implement them, but that never happened and failed. I'm sorry for taking too long. Dr. Harith? Mr. Hassam, regarding the coordination framework, if you mean the Prime Minister that is not a head of a bloc in the coordination framework, that is quite possible. And I believe that the forces of the coordination framework do not have they want a party that do not have an independent political party or political power to allow this person to assume the position of the prime minister for several years and then move them or discharge them so that they don't get any more powerful. They believe that if someone assumes this position for too long, then he will put his own interests before the national interests. So a prime minister that is not if you mean that is a prime minister that is not chosen by the coordination framework, I do not believe that's realistic. Also, Dr. Elias, I'm too scared to talk about economics with you. I've conducted interviews regarding the Iraq Development Fund and how the USA is dealing with that and the influx of the USD to Iraq. This was 4 to 5 years ago, so I cannot go into details. I do not remember them accurately. However, the issue, quite simply, is that the Iraqi central bank submits requests to the federal bank, US bank, needing remittances in USD, and to submit these applications, they need to attach the applications of Iraqi traders that would like to import commodities from outside Iraq, and the fact that they need these influxes of currency. So the federal bank verifies these requests and provides the remittances for the Iraqi government. This is quite an oversimplified version of what is happening, but in this way, when there was a slow rhythm of remittances, as I said, it's a cash-based economy in Iraq, and they need the hard currency from the central bank, and they sell this hard currency currency in currency auctions to maintain the value of the Iraqi currency. And so we have companies that serve as facades for armed factions to buy the hard currency from the central bank. At some point, the federal bank slowed down in providing remittances to Iraq, and now there is the threat of the nuclear option from the administration of Trump. So we could use that as a weapon for a political influence in Iraq. And also, Abdullah, regarding the sectarian slogans. There are several issues here. I believe that the issue of Syria did not have the enough sufficient time for us to talk about it. I believe that the situation in Syria has triggered so many concerns among Shiites, and not only the Shiite elites, but even among the community, the shared community. And so what happened in Syria has ignited the feeling of being threatened in Shiites that was invested by political forces. Otherwise, I believe the employment of sectarian slogans were not used only by certain factions. The military spokesperson of Hezbollah said in a festival that this Shiite weapon, he called it Shiite weapons, and will not relinquish it to anyone. And I believe this is part of the transformation from the narrative of resistance to the narrative of protecting Shiites, because the narrative of resistance entails so many risks right now, but protection of Shiites to them is an investable currency for them. Halbusi and Ammar Hakim, they have their own private reasons. We could talk about that, and it's related to political positioning. Ammar Hakim benefits from the withdrawal of Muqtada Sadr from the arena to appear as the umbrella of Shiites. And as for Halbusi, this is part of his attempt to position himself as the main Sunni leader. I believe these were the main questions that I had time to answer, and we could continue our dialogue later. Thank you so much, Dr. Haider, Dr. Harith, Dr. Sarahand, and the distinguished attendees for their interaction. Thank you so much.